Para quem não estava aqui de manhã, o Scarpione tem graduação em Educação Física pela Universidade do Maine, nos Estados Unidos, mestrado e doutorado em Fisiologia do Exercício pela Universidade de Illinois, também nos Estados Unidos. Atualmente ele é professor titular e chefe do Departamento de Ciências Nutricionais da Universidade do Arizona, nos Estados Unidos. E ele vai falar sobre as questões críticas, eu que coloquei importante, em pesquisa em composição corporal. Eu pedi a ele para tentar ficar focado nos slides, porque às vezes ele fala muito fora e talvez as pessoas não consigam acompanhar, tá bom?
Welcome back. This is either the really dedicated group or the group that couldn't get out to lunch, but either way, I'm glad you're back here. Everyone able to follow me okay last time? Pretty good? Okay, good. If I go too fast, let me know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are critical questions in body composition research from my perspective. Another perspective, you might get other ideas, but I'm going to sort of cover the three general areas of body composition research. And I drew off of a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago, so it's relatively recent. You know, 2 years, then research starts to get old. But I wrote this paper, Top 10 Research Questions Related to Body Composition, because a friend of mine asked me to. And you know what happens, a friend of yours becomes a journal editor. They say, hey, gee, I need a paper. Will you write one? You say, okay, you write one. Anyway, you can find the reference here and go back to this paper and follow up on today's talk if that's what you choose to do. The area of body composition research sort of falls into three different general areas. One is methodology. Some people spend their entire careers developing methods for research, for body composition research in this time. Other people use those methods to describe normal changes. We talked earlier today about the need for reference databases. What are the typical changes, the usual changes that take place in a healthy population? If we don't know that, then we can't describe really what's not typical, what's happening, in a clinical situation. Is a child growing the way they're supposed to grow? Or is an elderly person losing muscle when they should not be losing muscle, and those kinds of things? You need to have, obviously, good descriptions of normal. And then the third area has been changes in response to some challenge. So what happens when you impose a dietary intervention of some kind? Most of you, I think many of you are in the nutritional science field in some way or another. Believe it or not, I'm the chair of the Nutritional Sciences program at the University of Arizona. My training's in exercise. I consider myself an exercise guy. Somehow I ended up in nutritional sciences. And so far it's working out. They haven't kicked me out yet. You too. We and I go back. We have the same roots. So in that paper, I outlined what I thought were some critical questions. Some of my examples, a lot of them happen to do with nutrition and exercise because of my exercise background. So here are some questions in the assessment area. What are the, I don't know why I looked back there. I can't read that. But what are the appropriate reference methods? We talked a little bit about that this morning. What field methods can be used based on how they relate to the criterion methods? How should standards be determined? We have an obesity epidemic in the United States and around the world, in many places in the world. We still don't have, believe it or not, really good obesity standards by which to judge and draw clinical conclusions. And the same thing for muscle. What are health and function-related standards for muscle? Did it change? Okay, good. Then related to normal changes during the life stages. What are normal changes in body fatness with growth and healthy aging? What's the normal change in muscle with growth and healthy aging? What is the relationship between fat distribution and the health risks of obesity? We talked a lot about that, and we know that at least visceral fat is a major reason for metabolic dysregulation. But what about other fat depots? And then finally, what about muscle versus fat gain, and how does that relate to health and functional capacity? And then in the area of changes in response to challenges, again, I'm an exercise guy, so I'm using exercise examples. I think this is important because we know there's so much evidence about the health benefits of physical activity, exercise. You know, exercise is medicine. There's a whole movement about that. And so we need to do a better job, in my view, of understanding how folks respond to an intervention, either in terms of dose response, as you do more exercise, what happens, or in terms of the typical changes into an intervention. What are the role of different types of adipose tissue in obesity prevention and metabolic health? We talk about the risks involved, but maybe there are actually advantages to some depots. What are the interrelationships between different tissues? So we used to always think about bone, muscle, fat, almost as if they're separate. They're not separate. And of course, we now know they talk to each other quite a bit through various mechanisms. We know they talk to each other. We're not sure what the area codes are. We're not sure how they do it. We're learning more about that. And then why do some people respond to an intervention and why do others not respond? Because when you do an intervention, a dietary intervention or an exercise intervention, and you get an average effect, does that average effect really represent what happened to those people? Maybe it represents what happens in the population, if you could get the population to do it. But it probably misses what happens to individuals. Okay, those are sort of the things I want to address. Now I've got 100 slides, don't worry. I'll try to speak at a good pace. If I go too fast, just wave your hands at me or throw your shoe or something. And Luis is going to tell me when I'm halfway, and we'll make it. Don't worry, we'll make it. So what are the appropriate reference methods? Let me start with that. And again, we've already mentioned criterion methods, gold standard methods. We have a number of methods available to us to measure composition on many different levels. That's what's represented on this slide. If we wanted to, we could measure on the atomic level and put together a very complex model of human body composition. But obviously that's not relevant for most situations. So we go back to simple methods like the two-compartment model and some of the methods we've already talked about today. And Vivian told you everything you're ever going to want to know about bod pod and underwater weighing. They give similar estimates of body density. You've heard bod pod described, I'm sure, in the literature as a gold standard or as better than underwater weighing or something like that. Well, it gives you an estimate of body density. You still have to convert body density to composition in some way. So even though the bod pod looks a lot nicer than underwater weighing, and you don't have to get wet, and all of those good things, it still entails all of the assumptions that are involved in underwater weighing or some of the other simple methods. So here's the simple formulas based on the two-compartment model that we typically use as long as the assumptions of these other more complex models are met. Those methods give you a good estimate. They generally relate really well to young, healthy individuals. They don't relate well to kids who aren't growing normally or the elderly who are sick or any of those other kinds of situations. So, and this, whoops, got to change yours. And that's what this is showing here. We know that as children grow and mature, their body water falls, their bone mineral increases, their protein content increases. And those changes in the very things that we want to measure actually confound the simple method. So here we are trying to change something, trying to follow something as it changes with a method that's actually invalidated by the very thing we're trying to measure. That makes it much more complex. So in children, darn it. Luis, how do I go back? Sorry. I have to go back on the other side. Well, one more back. Yeah, right there. Okay. So in children, we need to measure more things. The bod pod and the underwater weighing and those simple models don't relate well to a child because the water is changing, because the mineral changes, because the muscle is changing. So generally, in adolescence, if we measure body water and we combine body water with density, we can do a very good measurement of body composition. The best we can do is to have water, mineral, and density. And in that case, we get probably the most accurate. And it's really not necessary. You don't gain much by going beyond to an even more complex model. I did that. I went the wrong, am I going the wrong way? Ah, okay. So, and we've already talked about DEXA, so I won't say much about that except, is it a new criterion method? Well, it's not a criterion method per se. There it is. It's not a criterion method per se, but it does allow us to measure multiple things that we can put together, multiple compartments, into a criterion method. And DEXA has given us a variety of databases and new reference standards. Let me caution you again, the standards relate to the instrument on which they're measured. So it would be a mistake to think that one reference database from one method, one manufacturer's instrument would be the same as another's. You have to be very careful when you look at the literature and apply the data that you're using a reference database from the same instrument you're using or making an appropriate conversion. But from this, at least in the US using Hologic, we do have whole body percent fat and lean soft tissue and bone mineral content and things like that. And also then various ratios like here, here, which are fat mass related to height and fat-free mass related to height and things like that. For the first time, we have some standard databases that we can use. And these types of percentile curves that help to describe normal growth. So we've made some real advances. On the other hand, these need to be checked. They need to be studied in other populations, other countries that need to develop reference databases similar to these rather than simply apply the ones that have been developed in the US. Okay, what about field methods? What field methods should be used? Well, you've probably seen a lot of papers written about the limitations of the body mass index. Even though body mass index has become sort of the standard, simple measurement in the field, we know that it doesn't truly capture body composition. And so you'll see paper after paper after paper about the obesity paradox. Why are heavier people healthier than lighter people? Why are people who are overweight doing better than people in normal weight range? We wouldn't expect that. Well, a lot of that is probably due to the limitations of the body mass index. And so while it's cheap and quick and easy in surveys, it's probably not the best measurement we can do. So I think all of these papers in all of these different clinical disorders about the obesity paradox are largely explained by the limitations of BMI. And we've got to do better than that. And of course, there's a variety of anthropometric field techniques, which have sort of been left by the wayside now. People are like, oh, you're using skin folds? You're using circumferences? I think, personally, that they're actually quite valuable. They give you more information than the BMI. You can combine them with BMI to learn more about the person that you're measuring. And I realize that anthropometry takes some skill. You have to be trained, you have to know what you're doing, etc. But still, I think it's been a mistake not to apply anthropometry and to not kind of let that go. Because although DEXA is more widespread, although body water is very useful, these techniques are not generally practical in large-scale surveys. So we really have to know how the anthropometric measures relate relate to the other types of measures that we have. So skin folds can give you a very good estimate of fat pattern. If you measure multiple sites in the body, you can say quite a bit about upper body, lower body, trunk versus appendages. You can say quite a bit about fat distribution. Waist circumference captures obviously more than body fatness, but nevertheless, waist circumference appropriately measured tells you quite a bit about central adiposity. It's a useful measure, particularly when combined with BMI. Upper arm circumference, or upper arm circumference corrected for the upper arm skin fold, historically has been an important index of nutritional status. Not least in the U.S., it's not used much anymore, and it should be, because it's a simple measure that we can do. All of these measures are limited by the validity of the equations if you convert them to a whole body index. But you don't necessarily need to do that. You can use these as indices of nutrition all on their own without going to percent body fat. There are a number of equations that have been published in the literature. We probably don't need any new equations, but we need to understand how the ones that we do have work in different populations. So I would claim there still has been a limited number of validation studies across all the range of equations that are available to us to understand which ones really work in different populations around the world. And you're going to hear a lot more about bioelectrical impedance today and tomorrow from the real experts, but I wanted to mention it because as anthropometry sort of fell out of favor, bioelectrical impedance became more in favor, and there's been quite a bit of work done with various approaches to BIA. It is simple to do, pretty cheap, inexpensive today relative to what it used to be, although some of the more entailed measurements, multiple frequency BIS, are more expensive, $10,000, $12,000 or more. That's expensive, at least the way I look at it. But still, there's a range of devices available. And we have single frequency historically was the way BIA was started, and it's limited by the assumptions of body shape and body hydration and a host of other factors, body temperature. There are a variety of factors that actually influence the outcome. Hence, multiple frequency and impedance spectroscopy and these other approaches have been developed to get away from those assumptions. And they work well. On the other hand, I would question, and the experts will tell us later, the accuracy of multiple frequency versus single frequency. The claim is that multiple frequency is much more accurate. Probably it has more, I have no doubt it has more clinical application. Is it more accurate in a healthy, normally hydrated population? Maybe not. I know the manufacturers say, and I know some of them well, friends of mine, that this improves quite a bit on the old approach. But we'll see later today from the other speakers how much the newer instruments actually gain you, at least outside of a clinical population. So I have some, the RGL was one of the early single frequency, and when you put electrodes on the ankle and foot and on the wrist and the hand, and the subject had to be lying supine, and that was the approach. And then one of the earliest multiple frequency was called Zytron. It was one of the earliest instruments. To my knowledge, this is a more recent iteration, and they're still in business. And now we have Omron, and we have different configurations. We have hand-to-hand, foot-to-foot. We have a variety of, as you can see from this slide, from this slide, you can see a variety of different configurations. Many different frequencies. Some give you a whole body. Some give you all the segments, etc. So lots of different approaches. So certainly there's a lot of interest and research going on with BIA, but I think we have a ways to go there in sorting out which of those approaches. And I'll tell you this, and our laboratory at Arizona has been involved in various projects over the years collecting data for companies that are producing Omron, Tanita, Zytron. All of these various companies have engaged with us, and we've provided data to help them. And I could not tell you the equations in the instrument, because once the data leaves your hands and goes into the instrument, then they do what they want to do. I'm not suggesting at all I don't trust them. I'm simply saying I don't know what happened from the data to the equation. And so you know, the company doesn't want to tell you what their equation is. You can understand why, but you have to then question. And I challenge you to find papers in the literature which have done a thorough job of testing across different instruments in different populations. Okay, yeah, ultrasound. A new approach. Now, ultrasound is not a new technique, but it's coming back as potentially a portable, inexpensive, accurate field technique. And you're starting to find more papers now written about ultrasound, particularly for a use in weight class sports, particularly in athletes who have to make weight, or in a sport in which aesthetics is very important, and we worry about them being underweight or losing weight or weight cycling. And ultrasound may have an advantage over BIA because it doesn't require the hydration assumption, or at least it's not as affected, and because it's not as affected by differences in connective tissue in the adipose tissue. At least that's the idea. So I think what you're going to see is more work with ultrasound. I know my good friend, some of you have probably read papers by a man named Timothy Lohman. I know Luis knows him well. I call him the old man of anthropometry, just to make fun of him. He was my advisor when I was a student. He's gotten very interested in ultrasound and is one of the people around the world now pushing it, along with the International Olympic Committee would like to see this develop. So what do we need? We need appropriate protocols. We need uniform guidelines. I can tell you from my limited experience with it, it still requires some training. The application of the transducer is very important. The site and how much pressure you put on the fat fold and those kinds of things are very important. So although it has great promise, it's got a ways to go. There are not population-based equations, and it hasn't really been tested against a multi-compartment model, which is the gold standard. So, okay. Switching gears. How should health-related obesity standards be determined and improved? Okay. It surprised me to know that with all of the emphasis on obesity and doing something about the obesity crisis, that we really didn't have very well developed health-related obesity standards. We have percentiles. You shouldn't be above the 95th percentile, the 90th percentile, or whatever cut point you believe in. How do those cut points get developed? Okay. Well, one way you can do it, and one way it's been done, is to derive against BMI. All right? So, what people have done is they've looked at what are the BMI standards for a given age, what is the definition based on BMI of overweight and obesity, 25 in men, if you apply the US or the World Health Organization standard, 25 and 30, right? 25 is overweight, 30. What is the equivalent of a BMI of 25 in an 18-year-old male and female? What is the equivalent of a 30 BMI in an 18-year-old male or female? And then you can back extrapolate. You can work backwards by age and say, okay, what's the equivalent BMI at all the different ages? And then, if you regress, do a regression of body fat on BMI, you can convert BMI to percent fat and say, okay, the standard should be 20% fat, or whatever it ends up to be in being. All right? And that's what this slide is sort of outlined. This is an approach that's been used in the literature. The problem with this approach is you are linked to the BMI. And we've already talked about the limitations of BMI. BMI is not a very good index. It's correlated with percent fat. It's not a very good index of percent fat. And so those errors are passed down to the new standard that you've tried to develop. All right? So you'll find curves like this in the literature. These are reference curves based, however, on calculating from the BMI. Okay, that's one way. And it's one of the, it was what was available at the time. Here's another way to do it. Link body fat, because body fat is a direct measure of obesity, right? Fatness. Link some method that you've used to measure body fat to some biological endpoint. What are we worried about? Well, we're worried about insulin resistance. We're worried about lipid profiles, dyslipidemia. We're worried about low-grade inflammation. Put it all together, you get metabolic syndrome. There are different definitions of metabolic syndrome. But still, you could choose a health-related criteria and say, ask yourself the question like this, okay? If I start with body fat, what level of body fat predicts disease risk? And use that as a way of developing a standard. So we did that, and this goes back almost 20 years. We did that initially using data from a study called the Bogalusa Heart Study. Christina knows about that because she knows about Louisiana. Bogalusa is a city outside of New Orleans, and they've been following children who are now adults, who now have their own children, who have children. They've been following them since the 1960s. It's a study of the natural history of heart disease. And they were very kind to share their data, and we were able then to link body fat. Now, that was measured by skin folds. It was all they had. We had to estimate body fat from skin folds, which is not bad, has some errors, but not bad. And we linked body fat to risk factors. So what this slide is showing is this is cholesterol, these are lipoprotein ratios, systolic and diastolic blood pressure. As the child goes up in body fat, their risk goes up. Well, you kind of expect that. You have more risk as you get fatter. And when we averaged over all of the risk factors, in boys, you can see the difference between 20 and greater than 25% fat. No extra risk. No extra risk until you reach 25% body fat. And it was the same in white males. It was the same in black males. And we did the same thing for females. I don't have that slide. No, I don't have that slide in here. But we did the same thing for females. For females, it was 30%, a little bit higher. Well, girls have more body fat than boys. That kind of makes sense. So these were the original standards that we promoted in the U.S. and became a part of our national fitness test. We do fitness testing in the schools in the U.S. Maybe you do it here too. And so this was the standard that was developed. And we've since redone the standards just in the last few years because now we have DEXA data from our national surveys. The Bogalusa study was one study, even though it was thousands of children, it was in New Orleans. It represented New Orleans, or it represented Louisiana, and so on. So what we've done now is using the DEXA data, we developed percentile curves to represent normal growth. Again, it's based on DEXA, it's based on Hologic, but this is what we have. So we've defined what normal growth looks like. And then we looked at how the body fat relates to health using metabolic syndrome, risk of metabolic syndrome as the indicator. And we did what's called an ROC analysis, receiver operating characteristic analysis, in which you can see how well does body fat predict who will have metabolic syndrome. So we applied that type of an analysis, and based on that approach, we came up with these new curves. And the curves are based on what is the normal pattern of change in fatness in boys and girls, and then at what level of fatness do they come at risk. So you can see these two curves here, which define normal, and then elevated risk, and then high risk. And these are the new standards that are being used in the U.S. as part of what's called the fitness gram. This says FG at the bottom. Fitness gram, it comes out of Cooper Clinic. You've probably heard of Kenneth Cooper. You've heard about maybe the Center for Aerobics Research in Dallas, Texas. And a group of us are the scientific advisors for that center. And this is one of the things we did. Halfway? All right. Whoa, 30 minutes. Well, okay. So this is how we arrived at. So these are new standards just been promoted in the last couple of years. So what we did then, because people want to use BMI, is we took our percent fat standards and then developed the related BMI. So we did the opposite. We didn't start with BMI. We started with percent fat. We used health as the criterion. We decided what level of fatness puts you at risk. Then we turned that into a BMI standard, just flipped it around the other way. So theoretically, the BMI is a better indicator of health under these circumstances, because the schools still want to use BMI. Surveys want to use BMI. So that's the reason we did it that way. And so now there are these new BMI standards that help to define risk. We have them for males, and we have them for females. Okay. So what has to happen, what's left to be done is to test these standards in other populations, in other samples, in other countries, to see if they really, truly, we know the relationship between BMI percent fat is not the same all around the world, is it? And so these kinds of indexes need to be worked out for other groups. All right. And then, all right, let me try. Oh, I went too far. So let me, yeah, no, it's not moving. There we go. I got it. So what about muscle mass? We really need to do the same thing for muscle mass. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I got a bunch of slides about muscle mass. So hang on to your seat. What about muscle mass? Obviously, sarcopenia has become a very important issue in the last decade, maybe a little bit before. It's been the last decade or so. We're worried about excessive muscle loss in the elderly and what that has to do with health and function. So there's been quite a lot of work to try to develop muscle mass standards. What are they? What is a quantitative, not qualitative, muscle loss, sarcopenia, qualitative, but what's a quantitative definition? So some of the approaches have been to develop norms in a young reference group, similar to the way we do it for osteoporosis. Elderly are applied against a young reference standard. You can do the same thing for sarcopenia. What's the normal amount of muscle, a typical amount of muscle for men and women, different heights, weights, etc., in a young age, and then use that to determine who's low at an older age. So that's been done. There are percentiles that have been done. Some people have used the approach of looking at muscle mass relative to the fat mass. Both influence your function. So maybe at a given level of fat mass, you need a different level of muscle mass in order to be healthy or in order to maintain your functional capacity. Or you can look at what are the functional consequences. So that's basically what this slide also shows, and I'll just focus a little bit at the bottom. Health risk assessment. I would argue we need to apply the same approach, where we measure muscle, we express it relative to size in some way, or relative to the fat mass, and then we determine how it relates to health and function, and use that as the approach to a cut point. What are some of the challenges? Well, we need to do better at defining normal. If you can't define normal, you can't define what's not normal. And so we just have to keep going back to that and refining that. And normal lean mass varies with your age, your gender, your race, also your fatness level, also your level of fitness. A variety of factors affect what might be normal, so we need to describe it for a different population. The relationship between fat mass and fat-free mass varies with age as well. It varies with height, gender, and body region, obesity. And so it's complex to define normal. We've also, did I get it? Got to go back. Hold on. Well, you want to go back? I've got to learn Portuguese. We also use the different approaches that we've been talking about. DEXA, densitometry, bioelectrical impedance, anthropometry, all give you little different measures, all little different answers. So when you read the literature, it becomes complex. You have to look carefully at what method was used and how does that affect the reference and how does that affect the findings and the definition. And so, and a lot of that is because when we apply these measures, they measure heterogeneous compartments. Fat-free mass as a concept is much more than muscle. It's the muscle, it's the organs. Oh, I didn't, here? Yeah. Oh, shoot. Hold on. Doesn't, oh. No. No? Well, stay there, I'll go there. Okay. Yeah, the one before, Louise. Okay. So fat-free mass measures many things. And so what's changing? Is muscle changing or organ weight changing? So we have to be really careful about these measurements. The trajectory of fat mass, the rate at which fat mass changes versus fat-free mass is different at different ages, and that confounds it. And then clearly as we grow older, for a period we gain weight. Not all of that obviously is lean, it's fat, but not all of that's fat. It's also some connective tissue. And sorting all that out is a challenge. In order to get an index, it's really useful in a clinical situation. Okay, so what should be measured? That's really what I've been talking about. Sarcopenia is a result of a number of different factors. Endocrine changes, changes with aging, primary changes with aging, neurodegenerative diseases, physical inactivity, cancer, all of these things affect muscle in a different way, affect function in a different way, and so sorting that out is difficult, and simply having a number that says you're sarcopenic or not sarcopenic maybe is a little bit too much to expect. Okay. As a result, some folks have come up with the idea of dynapenia, hand grip strength, or some measure of strength, right? And being low. Not low in muscle, but maybe you are, but low in strength. So maybe we need a functional measurement as well. And again, strength, as it varies with aging, can be a result of multiple factors. It can be I have relatively normal muscle mass, but I can't activate that muscle in order to generate force. Or it might be I have a wasting away of muscle, and neurally I'm fine. So we get there in different ways. And even if you use DEXA, DEXA measures mass. Doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the mass, the function of the mass. Okay, so let me go on. You can see we have a lot to do in terms of sarcopenia. Got it. Okay. What about normal change in body fatness with growth and healthy aging? I don't have too much to say about that. Just essentially what I've said before. Because of DEXA, we're getting better at describing what is normal. And we have these kinds of curves for the first time, really in very large samples, and we just need to keep doing that and develop better samples around the world. We have it from the NHANES data in the US, and we've developed these percentile curves, and you can use them to describe whether a child or an adult is changing in the way you'd expect. But I would caution you in simply applying, US population data to other areas of the world. What about normal changes in muscle? I've already said a bunch about that. Again, using DEXA, we have these databases, and we've tried to define normal, and it's a good start, and we need to keep doing that sort of thing. And a variety of indexes have come out of that. And applying these indexes and comparing them across different groups is very important to understand how they work, and I've said enough about that. I won't say any more about that. What about the relationship between fat distribution and obesity? Again, the BMI mortality paradox is an example of how BMI does not really tell us very much. And one of the major limitations of BMI in this context, of course, is it doesn't capture risks that are related to fat distribution. And I don't have to tell you that fat distribution is important. And we focused a lot of our attention on intra-abdominal or visceral fat because it's important and because we think that visceral fat is, in a way, causal even of primary metabolic disorders. There are other fat depots that contribute. What about intramuscular fat? What about the fat that invades skeletal muscle as you grow older? We relate that primarily with aging. I have a project in 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old little girls in the US. I have 500 of them that we've been studying. And even at that young age, their intramuscular fat, there isn't a lot of it. They're a range from normal weight to obese, but we don't have that many obese girls. But even at that young age, it relates to their bone development. In that particular project, I don't have cardiovascular risk factors. We're studying bone development. But I do have measures of bone strength and bone architecture using computed tomography to image the bones, a good measure of bone. And the fat, the intramuscular fat in the thigh already relates to bone strength. And the girls who have more fat have less bone strength. And they should be developing rapidly bone at that age, and it's impaired. And just to me, shows the importance of these other fat depots for other things besides cardiovascular risk. So what I meant to say here is certainly Jean-Pierre Dupré has written a great number of articles about the importance of visceral obesity as a cause. More and more we're talking about subcutaneous tissue, maybe as being protective, as counter to visceral. It may be, in fact, and of course, much of your body fat is subcutaneous. The majority of your body fat is subcutaneous under normal conditions, right? And visceral versus subcutaneous has different metabolic characteristics. It's different in a variety of areas. And so this subcutaneous fat may, in fact, if you are able to store your fat in those depots, offer you some protection. So we're starting to think about, did I go right? Whoops. There. We're starting to think about the impairment being in your ability to store fat subcutaneous. As long as you can store the fat in the subcutaneous layer on the abdomen, on the thigh, somewhere else, you may maintain your metabolic health. You may be at less risk. And when you cannot do that and you begin to accumulate the fat in the visceral region, that's when you begin to see the higher risk for cardiometabolic disorders. Okay. And what about the role of muscle? So just going back for a minute. So we need more work in that area. We need more work in understanding how different fat depots relate to your health and your function. And there are other fat depots I didn't mention because I'm going to run out of time and Luis is going to kick me off the stage. But Okay. What about the role of muscle loss versus fat gain? And how does that impact your health? And of course, we know with aging, we add body fat. And we know that two people, young versus old, and this is an 82-year-old versus a 37-year-old, they have the same waist circumference, but they have quite different visceral fat and quite different subcutaneous fat. So, a limitation of waist circumference, but a normal change that happens with aging. And we also know that with aging, muscle subcutaneous fatness on the thigh increases. So does intramuscular fat invasion. So for the same thigh circumference, you have more fat intramuscularly, and that conveys a risk. So we worry about what some people have called the double metabolic burden, the burden of sarcopenia, muscle loss, and its consequences combined with added body fat or obesity. So when two exist together, that may be explained, the oldest old, the frail, the folks who have the greatest challenges. You can get there in different ways. You can get there by gaining body fat and losing muscle. You can gain there by losing body fat if you're overweight and you're losing body fat, and that happens in the elderly, right? At some point, their weight's stable for a period, they begin to lose weight. They don't necessarily lose fat and muscle, both. They don't necessarily lose at the same rate. So you can get there by gaining weight, but your muscle mass does not compensate, or you can get there by losing weight and losing muscle, even though you're losing some fatness. So there's been quite a bit of work, I already mentioned, to define these indexes. So we've struggled to define what is sarcopenia. We're getting better at defining obesity. What's the definition of both together? Is it simply a matter of taking the two and putting them together, or should it be something else? And yeah. So the indexes we have available today do not represent the quality of muscle tissue, which is a major challenge, and we need to get better at that. It may be combining the mass measurement along with the function measurement will get us as close as we can. As a result, we're not sure about the prevalence. We're not sure about how well these indexes diagnose. We don't know how much they predict future consequences. There's a lot of work to be done to develop these definitions and then to understand whether they truly delineate who's at risk, who's not, who's going to go on to further decline, and who's not. So we've got a lot of work to do in that area. Here's a ratio, an index that's been proposed, fat mass divided by fat-free mass. If you look at fat mass, sorry, got it? If you look at, thank you. If you look at fat mass as the burden, and as you look at fat-free mass as your capacity to carry that burden, the ratio of the two may be an interesting index. And that's been proposed, but it really hasn't been well studied. So this slide simply says we need to do a lot of work to better understand the underlying physiology. We need to do some work to understand whether this new index or the old indexes pick out who's at risk and who isn't. And then we need to do longitudinal studies to see if they actually predict who will decline more than others in the future. Okay. So I got a little bit of time left, not a lot. You tell me, huh? Okay, not too bad. So what are some of the other, another area of body composition research has been what changes occur in response to a challenge. And the challenge might be illness, but the challenge might be what you believe to be a nutritional, a dietary intervention that's good for the person, or an exercise intervention that's good for the person, or some other challenge like that. So what about exercise? We're going to use as an example, dose response. This is what dose response means. It simply means what's the change as it relates to the intervention that you impose. If I give you a little bit of exercise, how much of a change takes place? If I give you a lot of exercise, how much of a change takes? And does it happen in a predictable way? There's really not a large literature in the exercise field, at least, in terms of dose response. You think of it in terms of medications. We do dose response studies in terms of medications. But what about in terms of a dietary or an exercise intervention? So here's another way to think about it. Okay, the top line, it may be as the amount of exercise you do. This is frequency, intensity, duration. This is the volume of exercise. As you do more exercise, you adapt, but the adaptation becomes less as you go higher. Or it might be this type of a curve where you get a greater and greater adaptation, greater rate of adaptation as you do more exercise. Now, if you go out and exercise, if you're like me, you know that after about 10 minutes you're done anyway, so you're never going to find this out. No, I'm kidding. But these types of curves have not been applied consistently in body composition research because they're difficult studies to do. You have to have multiple levels of intervention in your study, and that's hard to do. It's hard to keep people engaged. It's expensive. It's hard to apply all the body composition methods. We don't have many studies that have done this in children and adolescents. We've done a reasonably good job in weightlifting kinds of exercise, right? Believe it or not, I'm a weightlifter. I don't look like it, though, do I? Anyway. My father was an Olympic weightlifter. Didn't happen for me, but oh well. Anyway, but you know, we know that as people lift heavier weights or do more sets or more repetitions, there is a muscular adaptation that goes up, at least within the realm of studying 1, 2, 3 sets, and that, you know, the type of work that's been done. There's been some limited work done with aerobic exercise, but a lot of that has been on fitness measured like on a treadmill, VO2 max, those kinds of things, much less so in the area of body composition, and almost none on skeletal adaptations. We've done some well-controlled studies in animals, but in humans we really haven't done dose-response studies in terms of skeletal development. So we have a ways to go in that area. I'm going to just go quickly here. The dose-response studies that have been done a few in recent years because of the problem with obesity. So looking at weight loss or fat loss or something like that with different levels of exercise. Generally, they've been a low dose versus a high dose with not very much in between. And so in Medline searches, basically what it's shown is not much of this work has been done, and there was no really good evidence to say that there was a dose response. There have been a few attempts at randomized controlled trials, again, with some evidence that dose response may be true, but not all have shown that. Visceral fat, one study has looked at visceral, or more than one now, but a few studies have looked at visceral fat, and no apparent gain, no apparent effect of intensity, volume, somewhat a dose response. So I'll leave that and go on to another one. So we've got a lot of work to do to really understand how body composition changes in response to different levels of intervention. We need to know that information in order to target our interventions better. Nobody wants to do more than they have to. So in order for us to be effective in our public health campaigns, we really need to know that. What's the role of different types of adipose, what's the role of different types of adipose tissue? We've talked about visceral fat putting you at risk. Other fat depots put you at risk. Some may be protective. Is there a way to manipulate fat to help you maintain your body weight? That's an interesting idea. And you've heard about brown adipose tissue, which we know exists in humans. We know exists in neonates. Generally, we've, for years, thought, well, it's not really relevant in adults, though, is it? The amount of brown adipose tissue in humans is small to begin with. It's really not relevant in adults. But More recently, what's happened is using MRI or sophisticated imaging, in fact, adults have brown adipose tissue depots. It's not a lot, but it's there. It's in the sites you'd expect it to be, and it's highly metabolically active. What if you could manipulate those depots in some way to drive energy metabolism, to drive energy expenditure? And that's a proposal that's been made. Not a lot of work has been done. Been some work done in experimental animals. We know that you can induce brown adipose tissue through cold. No one wants to go through a cold intervention. But if we made you feel very cold, there is an adaptation. Lo and behold, some evidence suggests you can do the same thing through the appropriate kinds of exercise. Maybe that's another application of exercise. Who knows? I thought it was an intriguing thought. I've even heard people talk about surgical implantation of brown adipose tissue. Who knows? But possibly through the exercise avenue, this could be an adaptation, another way in which we can adapt body composition to help in the realm of obesity prevention. 5 minutes? Piece of cake. Okay. What about crosstalk? What about communication between different tissues? I said in the old days we thought about muscle, bone, adipose tissue, sort of separate components, and they were just there, each doing their thing. And now certainly tremendous amount of work has been done showing the role of adipose tissue as an endocrine organ. And what about muscle? Well, now we know about muscle myokines having not only a local effect, but some of them a systemic effect. We know that. Yep. Oh, I didn't. Sorry. Yeah, I should have gone there. We know that muscle myokines influence other tissues. And we're starting to learn the role of bone in energy metabolism, in regulating energy metabolism. Who thought bone had a role in that? And it's just been in recent years that we've learned more about that. So related to that, we're starting to rethink how body fat, how adiposity relates to osteoporosis. It wasn't that long ago that the one thing that was good for your bone was overweight. Well, if you're overweight, the extra weight, the mechanical effect on your bone stimulates greater bone mass. That's how we thought about it. So at least there was one good thing about being overweight. That paradigm is now being questioned. There's more and more data showing, in fact, in children, overweight, obese children, despite the potential protection in a way of having the extra tissue to absorb a fall, they have more fractures. Not just because they fall more. Same is true in older folks as well. So we're questioning that whole idea that fat is actually protective against fractures. And basically what this slide is showing is, on this side, some reasons that extra adipose tissue may protect you, but also many reasons why it might not. That's the study we're doing now in girls in Arizona. We hope to measure 450 little girls, and we're looking at the various levels of body fatness and how their bone changes over the rapid growth period, around the time of peak height velocity, as you're growing tall very rapidly. That's when you should be consolidating your skeleton, you should be adding a lot of mineral. And what happens if you're overweight and have metabolic syndrome? What if you're at risk for diabetes? Versus being overweight but metabolically healthy. And what we think happens is if you're overweight but otherwise doing well, your skeleton is growing normally, and maybe the extra weight is actually an advantage. But if you're overweight, obese, and you have metabolic syndrome, if you have insulin resistance, insulin is very important for bone, your skeleton is not growing the way it should, and puts you at greater risk later in life for osteoporosis. And a lot of that thinking comes out of the idea that bone and fat share a common stem cell, right? So osteoblasts, adipoblasts are both derived from the same precursor, for example, in the bone marrow. And so depending on the environment, maybe depending on your level of physical activity, depending on your nutritional status, that cell can go in a different direction. And it may help to explain why we have this fatty infiltration that takes place, more so than you'd expect even at a young age in inactive children. So the question is, does the fat infiltration in the low bone cause low bone mass, or as a result of bone loss? We don't really know. We don't really know. So there's still quite a bit of work left to be done to understand what factors influence this situation, how fat affects the bone, vice versa. And I was mentioning myokines earlier, and all that I'll say about myokines is, there are several hundred products secreted, if you will, by muscle. And a number of them now are thought of being myokines. And it turns out, for example, and this says muscle injury, it could be injury, but even during exercise, products are secreted by muscle, right? And FG2, I'm going to struggle to say it, fibroblast growth factor, in fact, derived in muscle during exercise, has an effect on osteoprogenitor cells, bone precursor cells, in the bone. So there may be, in fact, we know that exercise, we know that muscle is very important for bone. We know that muscle development influences bone development. We know physical activity influences bone. Is it just because of the mechanical effect? If I were to jump down off of this stage right now, I'd probably kill myself. But if I jump down off the stage right now and I have a large impact on my bones adapt to that. In our study of the little girls, what we have them doing is jumping down off a table like that, 24 inches high. They jump down 40 times a day to see how the impact changes the shape of their bones. It may change it in a very positive way. How does that impact do that? Well, one way might be through actually myokines that respond to the exercise that then affect the bone. And this similar story, myostatin, myostatin is an important regulator of muscle hypertrophy, and myostatin also influences bone. So maybe another biochemical way in which bone and muscle are talking to each other and influencing one another. Okay, and then the last thing I have to say in my last couple of minutes, okay, what factors explain individual response to intervention? I was saying this earlier, okay? When we do a large intervention and we test the average effect, it's often small. I could put you on, I've done a series of exercise studies related to bone over my career in different ages, in children, in middle age, in elderly. All ages respond to exercise. The adaptation is quite small. Oh, they improved 1%, 2%, 3%. When it's 3%, we jump up and down and cheer. That's actually a reasonably big average effect in bone when you do an exercise intervention. It's not a lot to get the people who though, control public health policy too excited. But what we see in these studies over and over again, and I should just go on, is this type of an effect. All of these dots, I hope you can see it, the colors aren't very good, but all of these dots represent individuals. So the average effect doesn't really capture what's happening to the individuals. These happen to be women who were given hormone replacement, estrogen replacement, and who were exercised and who were also given calcium also, because we want to eliminate calcium as a factor. And see the wide range of response. Some of them had a very large response in bone. And some, despite doing everything you were supposed to do, right? What do you tell these are postmenopausal women. So in the U.S., less hormone replacement than there used to be because of now we know about some of the consequences. But still, when we did this study, no one thought too much about those consequences then. But they were on hormone, they were on estrogen, they were taking calcium, doing exercise. They still lost bone. That's not supposed to happen. How do you explain that? Here's another study or another analysis in these same women looking at body fat. You see the same thing. All right. We weren't intentionally trying to get them to lose weight. But here's the body fat response to that intervention. And many lost body fat, some gained. That's not supposed to happen. So how do you explain that difference? Where we're moving more and more with our interventions is, in the U.S. at least, there's a lot of talk about personalized medicine, right? Targeting our interventions to the individual. Why do some individuals respond and some do not? If we know that, we can target our programs much better. We can target them, deliver them to the people who respond, and find something else for the other people that's going to be more useful. So it's about genetics, but it's not just about genetics. It's about genetics, and it's about the genetic environment interaction. It's about epigenetics. And so understanding gene-environment interactions, understanding who responds and who doesn't respond is, sort of where the science is going now. I'll tell you this, in the U.S., at least one area, if you want to get funded, we all like to be funded for our research, this is where it's going to go. President Obama gave a big speech about how important this was. Somebody told him, I guess. National Institutes of Health, which funds a lot of our research, obviously, in the U.S., has made this a priority. You're going to see more and more work in this area. So certainly a reasonable amount of work has been done to understand the genetics of obesity. And we know, or people are beginning to understand what genes relate to obesity, what genes do not. Interestingly, despite a variety of genes that have been suggested to be important, they don't explain that much of the variability, do they? So it's about genes, but it's about a lot more as well. And I'm just going to kind of wrap it up. Here's some of our own work from the same study I was showing you earlier. We developed a genetic risk score, so we could say these are the folks who are most at risk, and then we looked at who responded to the exercise intervention and who didn't. And as it turned out, the people who had the lowest risk of obesity based on polymorphism and creating a genetic risk score, the people who had the lowest risk actually did the best on the exercise study. So, presumably you could develop a risk score like this, apply it to an individual and say, oh, you do really well on this intervention. Oh no, you need something else. Okay, so that brings me to the very last slide, which is right where I started. All right, these three boxes sort of capture. Oh, yes, I do. Thank God Luis is here today. Back to where I started. These three boxes capture, sort of the realm of body composition research pretty well. Assessment. There's quite a bit left to be done to develop methods that we can use not only in the laboratory but out in the field, particularly in large-scale surveys, so we can get better and better information. And bioelectrical impedance, you'll hear more about today, is probably one of those that we'll continue to improve, and you'll see it applied more and more. What are the normal changes during the life stage? It seems, if I were a student, I would be questioning, what is this guy talking about? What do you mean we don't know what is normal? Well, normal depends on the method that you use. So there's an interaction always between your methodology and then what you're describing. And as methodology gets better, our description of what's normal, what's not normal gets better. It's back and forth all the time. That's just going to be the evolution of science. That's how it works. So everyone who's a student in the audience, don't despair, because you're going to have to repeat everything we did anyway. changes in response to challenges. I think the frontier there is understanding why people respond, why people don't respond, and being able to target our interventions so they help the most people. I'm going to be quiet. Thank you.